Killer of a 17-year-old girl.
Her body found in a snowpack off Highway 243 near Banning after she had been raped and bludgeoned to death. After the Riverside County Sheriff's Department received an anonymous tip from a caller.
Imagine calling the police to report finding a body. Now imagine that same body was someone you killed. It sounds like something out of a twisted crime novel, but that's exactly what happened in Beaumont, California in 1979. A killer so confident in his ability to evade capture that he literally led police to his own crime scene and then watched them fail to catch him for 45 years. The morning was bitterly cold, snow blanketing the ground along Highway 243 when the anonymous call came in. The caller's voice was steady, almost eerily calm, as he directed law enforcement to what he claimed was a chance discovery. But this was no random find. This was a calculated move by a killer who had just committed what he thought was the perfect crime. What investigators would discover that morning would shake the small town of Beaumont to its core. The body of 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez, brutally raped and beaten, partially buried in the snow. But the most chilling part of this story isn't just the murder itself. It's how the killer hid in plain sight for nearly half a century, protected by a failed polygraph test and the limitations of 1970s forensic science. This isn't just another cold case. This is the story of how a murderer's arrogance led him to report his own crime, counting on the fact that nobody would suspect the helpful citizen who called it in. It's a tale of justice delayed, but not denied, where modern science would finally unravel a killer's decades-old confidence game. This is the story of Esther Gonzalez and the 45-year journey to uncover a truth that was hiding in plain sight all along.
It seemed like, with Randy and stuff, they should have brought him in at least to talk to him. I mean, I know he passed his test or whatever, but I don't know. It just seemed like they could have done something more about him.
But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case.
Beaumont, California, 1979 was a different world. Nestled between mountains and desert, this small town of tightly knit communities was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors, where teenagers could walk home after dark without fear, and where violent crime was something that happened in big cities, not in their own backyard. It was here that Esther Gonzalez spent her 17 years, the cherished youngest child of a large, loving family. Being the baby of the family had shaped her entire personality. She was the one who could make everyone smile, the peacemaker, the dreamer. Her sister Elizabeth would later recall how Esther had a way of lighting up any room she entered. Her warm smile and gentle nature making her impossible not to love.
She was really sweet. She wouldn't hurt anybody.
In early 1979, Esther was living the typical life of a high school senior at Beaumont High. Her days were filled with classes, friends, and dreams of the future that stretched endlessly before her. In just a few months, she would graduate, joining the class of '79 in their caps and gowns, ready to embrace whatever opportunities life had in store. She had that mixture of innocence and hope that defines so many 17-year-olds, old enough to glimpse the adult world ahead, but young enough to still believe in the inherent goodness of people. But like any teenager, Esther's life wasn't without its struggles. The natural tensions between a young woman seeking independence and parents trying to protect their youngest child occasionally bubbled to the surface. These arguments were normal, healthy even, part of growing up. No one could have known that one such disagreement would set in motion a chain of events leading to tragedy. On February 9th, 1979, Esther had an argument with her father, the kind that happens in households across America every day. The subject of their disagreement has been lost to time, likely seeming inconsequential even then. But its aftermath would haunt her family forever. Frustrated and wanting space, Esther decided to walk to her sister's house in nearby Banning, a journey she had made countless times before. Her sister Elizabeth, sensing the tension, offered to give her a ride later that evening. It was a simple gesture of kindness, the type of offer siblings make every day without thinking. But Esther, perhaps still caught in the aftermath of the argument, declined.
She got upset with my dad. I don't know what he's told her, but she got upset, took off walking.
She wanted to walk, to clear her head in the cool winter air. It was a decision that would cost her life, and one that would haunt Elizabeth for decades to come. None of them knew it then, but this ordinary teenage moment, an argument, a declined ride, a familiar walk, would be the last chapter of Esther's story.
I tell myself, why didn't we follow her? Because she just wanted to ride to her boyfriend.
February nights in Beaumont can be unforgiving. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset, and in 1979, the winter had been particularly harsh. On that February 9th evening, as Esther set out on her walk to Banning, the mountain air was already turning bitter cold. The same route she had walked so many times before suddenly seemed different in the gathering darkness. What happened to Esther between leaving her house and the discovery of her body remains largely unknown. The walk to her sister's house should have taken less than an hour, but somewhere along that familiar path, she encountered pure evil. Investigators would later piece together that she had been attacked, sexually assaulted, and brutally beaten to death. Her final moments must have been filled with unimaginable terror. The next morning painted a grim picture. Snow had fallen overnight, nature's attempt to cover up the horror that had taken place. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the Riverside County Sheriff's Department received a call that would kickstart one of their longest-running investigations. The caller's voice was unnaturally calm as he reported finding a body along Highway 243. The response was immediate. When deputies arrived at the scene, they found themselves on a remote stretch of Highway 243, a winding mountain road that cuts through some of Southern California's most isolated terrain. There, partially buried in the fresh snow, lay the body of a young woman. It didn't take long to identify her as Esther Gonzalez. The crime scene told a story of savage violence. Esther had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned with such force that the medical examiner would later struggle to document all her injuries. The killer had shown no mercy, no humanity. After the attack, he had left her there in the snow, discarded like trash along the highway. The peaceful mountain road, usually known for its scenic beauty, had become the site of unthinkable brutality. The location itself raised questions. Highway 243 wasn't on Esther's regular route to her sister's house. How did she end up there? Was she forced into a vehicle? Did she accept a ride from someone she knew? These questions would haunt investigators for decades. As word of the discovery spread, the tight-knit community of Beaumont was shaken to its core. Parents kept their children indoors, neighbors eyed strangers with suspicion, and the carefree atmosphere that had defined this small town evaporated overnight. The brutal reality of what had happened to one of their own destroyed any illusion of safety they had maintained. The snow that had blanketed Esther's body had also complicated the crime scene investigation. While it had preserved some evidence, it had also obscured potentially crucial clues. Nevertheless, investigators meticulously collected what they could, including biological evidence that would prove crucial decades later. At the time, though, they had no way of knowing just how important these samples would become, or that the killer himself had already inserted himself into the investigation. What no one realized then was that the anonymous caller, the man who had led police to Esther's body, wasn't just a random Good Samaritan. He was the killer himself, hiding behind an act of civic duty that would protect him for nearly half a century. It was a calculated move that demonstrated not just cunning, but an almost unthinkable level of cold-blooded confidence. In the immediate aftermath of discovering Esther's body, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department launched what they believed would be a straightforward investigation. After all, they had something most departments dream of: someone who could lead them directly to the crime scene. What they didn't realize was that this apparent stroke of luck was actually part of the killer's calculated plan. The anonymous caller was quickly identified as Louis Randolph Randy Williamson. In an era before caller ID and cell phone tracking, Williamson had been surprisingly willing to come forward and identify himself as the tipster. He appeared cooperative, concerned, and exactly what you'd expect from a good citizen who had stumbled upon something horrible. When detectives interviewed Williamson, they found themselves face to face with a man who seemed genuinely helpful. His story was simple. He had been driving along Highway 243 that morning when he spotted something unusual in the snow. Upon closer inspection, he discovered it was a body and immediately called the police. His demeanor was calm, his answers consistent, his behavior exactly what you might expect from an innocent person who had made a gruesome discovery. "I just knew I had to report it," he told investigators, his voice steady and sure. "I couldn't just leave her there in the snow." The performance was masterful, just the right mix of civic duty and controlled emotion. Not once did he slip up or show the kind of anxiety you might expect from a killer being questioned about his own crime. In what would later prove to be a critical mistake, investigators suggested Williamson take a polygraph test. It was standard procedure in 1979, a time when lie detector tests were considered nearly infallible. Williamson agreed without hesitation. Another calculated move that would help cement his appearance of innocence. To everyone's surprise, he passed the polygraph. This single test result would prove to be a devastating misdirection. With their prime suspect seemingly cleared by science, investigators were forced to look elsewhere. It was a crucial error that would protect Williamson for decades to come. Meanwhile, the physical evidence collected from the scene painted a horrific picture of Esther's final moments. The medical examiner confirmed she had been sexually assaulted and beaten to death. Semen samples were collected, evidence that would eventually crack the case wide open. But in 1979, DNA testing was still years away from becoming a reliable forensic tool. These crucial samples were carefully preserved, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. As weeks turned into months, traditional detective work yielded few results. Interviews with Esther's friends and family revealed no obvious suspects. The community, though horrified by the crime, could offer no meaningful leads. The case began to grow cold, even as Williamson continued his life in plain sight, probably marveling at how easily he had fooled everyone. The investigation's focus shifted multiple times. Other potential suspects were interviewed and cleared. Theories were developed and discarded. All the while, the real killer had been the first person they'd spoken to, the helpful citizen who had reported finding the body, who had passed their lie detector test, who had played his part so perfectly that no one thought to look deeper. By the end of 1979, the case had effectively stalled. The initial investigation files were filled with dead ends, failed leads, and one crucial oversight. They had already interviewed the killer and let him walk away. Time, however, doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just makes them deeper. For the Gonzalez family, each passing year without answers was another layer of pain added to their tragedy. The calendar became a cruel reminder. Birthdays Esther would never celebrate, graduations she would never attend, a future she would never see. Her father carried the heaviest burden. That final argument with Esther, so normal, so ordinary at the time, had become a weight he couldn't shed. "If only I hadn't argued with her," he would say in quiet moments. "If only I had gone looking for her that night." The if-onlys became a litany of regret that echoed through the decades. Elizabeth, the sister who had offered that fateful ride, found herself trapped in her own cycle of guilt. "I should have insisted," She would later tell investigators, "I should have followed her, picked her up anyway." Her loving gesture of offering a ride, rejected in a moment of teenage stubbornness, had become a ghost that haunted her dreams.
I tell myself, why didn't we follow her,
The 1980s rolled into the 1990s. Beaumont changed. The small town grew larger. Newer families moved in, and younger residents had no memory of the tragedy that had once shaken their community. But for those who remembered, the unsolved murder of Esther Gonzalez remained an open wound, a reminder that a killer still walked among them. The case files gathered dust, but they were never truly forgotten. Different investigators over the years would pull them out, hoping fresh eyes might spot something missed. Each time the case was reopened, the Gonzalez family's hopes would rise, only to be dashed again when no new leads materialized. It was an emotional roller coaster that seemed endless. Meanwhile, forensic science was evolving. The development of DNA testing in the late 1980s revolutionized criminal investigations. Cold cases across the country were being solved through this new technology. Yet Esther's case remained stubbornly closed. The evidence collected in 1979 sat in storage, waiting for its moment. Throughout these years, Louis Randolph Williamson continued living his life in plain sight. Did he think about Esther? Did he feel secure in his deception, protected by that past polygraph test from 1979? Did he ever cross paths with her family in the small town, carrying his dark secret while they grieved? These questions would only be answered decades later. The most painful part of these lost years was watching other cases get solved while Esther's remained open. Each time another cold case made headlines, thanks to DNA evidence or a confession, the Gonzalez family wondered, why not Esther's case? Why not their closure? They didn't know that the evidence that would eventually crack the case was already in police possession, preserved from that snowy morning in 1979. As the new millennium arrived, a new generation of investigators began to take interest in cold cases. Advanced forensic techniques were making the impossible possible. The preserved evidence from Esther's case, including those crucial biological samples, suddenly held new potential. But technology alone wasn't enough. It would take a dedicated team of cold case investigators to finally put all the pieces together. By 2014, when Williamson died of natural causes, no one suspected his connection to the case. He took his secret to the grave, probably believing he had committed the perfect crime. In a twist of fate, a routine blood sample taken during his autopsy would later become the key to unraveling his decades of deception. These were the lost years, years of pain, uncertainty, and unanswered questions, but they were also years of advancing science, preserving evidence, and laying the groundwork for what would eventually become a breakthrough in one of California's most puzzling cold cases. 2023 marked a watershed moment in forensic science. What was impossible in 1979 had become routine, and cases once considered unsolvable were being cracked open across the country. The Riverside County Regional Cold Case Homicide Team had seen enough of these breakthroughs to know that no case was truly hopeless, not even one as old as Esther's. When they reopened Esther's case file, they found themselves looking at evidence that had been waiting patiently for over 4 decades. The semen samples collected from that snowy morning in 1979 had been meticulously preserved, like a message in a bottle waiting to be discovered. But this time, they had something their predecessors didn't: the power of forensic genealogy. Enter Othram, a cutting-edge forensic laboratory in Texas that had been making waves in the true crime community. Unlike traditional DNA labs, Othram specialized in cases others considered impossible: degraded evidence, tiny samples, decades-old specimens. They had developed proprietary techniques that could extract DNA profiles from evidence that other labs might have dismissed as hopeless. The process was painstaking. First, the lab had to determine if they could even get usable DNA from the 45-year-old samples. It was like trying to read a book that had been left out in the rain for decades. The information was there, but accessing it required extraordinary care and cutting-edge technology. These old samples are always a challenge, one Othram scientist would later explain. But sometimes, the older the case, the better preserved the evidence, because it was collected in an era when investigators gathered everything, not knowing what might eventually be useful. Using advanced extraction techniques and next-generation sequencing, the team began building a DNA profile from the preserved evidence. It was a process that would have seemed like science fiction to the original investigators in 1979. Piece by piece, the genetic puzzle came together. Once they had a workable DNA profile, the real detective work began. Forensic genealogists began the meticulous process of building family trees, searching through public databases and tracking down distant relatives who might share genetic markers with their unknown suspect. It was like trying to find a specific drop of water in a river, tracing it back to its source. Then came the moment that changed everything. The DNA profile led them to a familiar name: Lewis Randolph Williamson, the same man who had called in the anonymous tip, the same man who had passed the polygraph test, the same man who had been hiding in plain sight for 45 years. But there was a catch. Williamson had died in 2014, seemingly taking his secrets to the grave. Had they hit another dead end? Not quite. During routine autopsy procedures, a vial of Williamson's blood had been preserved. This final piece of evidence would prove crucial.
Once we started looking into Randy further, we determined that that he passed away in 2014, and that when he passed away, during his autopsy they had collected a vial of blood.
When investigators compared the DNA from Williamson's preserved blood sample to the evidence collected from Esther's body, they found an exact match. The science was irrefutable. The mystery caller who had led police to Esther's body hadn't just discovered her by chance. He was her killer. Williamson hadn't just committed murder. He had orchestrated one of the most audacious cover-ups imaginable. While other killers ran from their crimes, he had walked straight into the investigation, using his anonymous call not as an act of conscience, but as his insurance policy. His performance had been masterful. The detective's notes from 1979 revealed a man so convincing, so seemingly genuine, that even a polygraph test couldn't detect his deception. Every move was calculated. From choosing Highway 243, far from Esther's normal route, to his composed demeanor during questioning. He had selected the perfect spot to commit his crime, and later discover the body without raising suspicion. The timing of his death in 2014 meant Williamson had escaped earthly justice, living 35 years as a free man while the Gonzalez family suffered. Elizabeth, Esther's sister, captured the family's mixed emotions. Part of me is relieved to finally know, but another part is angry that he took this secret to his grave.
We feel closure. I mean, I know he died, but, he's got to face God, so that's what I'd be afraid of.
I'm just glad that we finally found out who it was.
The revelation sent shockwaves through Beaumont. Residents who had interacted with Williamson over the decades struggled to reconcile the helpful citizen they knew with the monster he truly was. But while many questions died with him, his case proved something crucial. There is no such thing as a perfect crime. As we close this tragic chapter, we're left wondering, how many other killers have hidden behind masks of civic duty? How many families are still waiting for answers locked away in preserved DNA evidence? Williamson might have died thinking he had committed the perfect crime, but justice had its own timeline. DNA doesn't forget, and secrets don't stay buried forever. If this story moved you, make sure to hit like and subscribe for more true crime cases where justice finally caught up with those who thought they'd escaped it. Leave a comment below. What other cold cases do you think could be solved with today's technology? Until next time, remember, it's never too late for the truth to emerge.